You know something is wrong when an American Affidavit of Probable Cause. Part 7. More Chicanery. As far back as 1871, a fake corporate Congress merely claiming to represent the Republic of the United States of America was also claiming an ownership interest in all United States corporations. Over time, they would claim to own all American corporations too. 1900 to 1904, the Insular Tariff cases. In a series of Supreme Court cases known as the Insular Tariff cases, Congress got official permission to set up shop for itself. As a result of these decisions, Congress had the green light to create a separate nation for itself, using the federal territories and possessions as states, complete with their land jurisdictions. Guam, Puerto Rico, American Samoa, and the other insular states formed a Union of American States and began operation as the United States of America Minor. Another federation of states operated as a constitutional democracy and under a deceptively similar name. From then on, the Congress routinely referred to this entity as if it were referring to the continental United States. The criminal semantic deceits that began with the Civil War multiplied like rabbits in the spring. Any number of scoundrels having enough money to start with can establish themselves as a government, because with money they can hire soldiers, and with soldiers extort more money, and also compel general obedience to their will. Lysander Spooner. Circa 1912. A group of mostly European banking interests, plus some turncoat American bankers, formed a private association and called it the Federal Reserve, so the people would naturally assume it was part of the federal government. They combined resources to purchase a middleman spot for themselves between the Congress and their intended victims, all United States corporations. They bought the United States of America Incorporated, together with its state franchises and agencies, as a business venture. The members of Congress were now tacitly working for them. These banks took over the Governmental Services Corporation without a word to anyone. It was just a private corporate management change impacting the whole country and everyone in it. Why tell anyone? The Federal Reserve, which was always federal in the same sense as Federal Express, began operating familiar agencies like the U.S. Department of Labor and the U.S. Department of Agriculture and the U.S. Small Business Administration, all for private gain, to manipulate markets, to lock up competing resources, to establish monopolies for themselves, to buy off unions, and to establish punitive regulatory schemes. As a first step, they killed off the American railroads because they could make more money selling oil and gas products to an inefficient truck fleet. With Theodore Roosevelt's help, they kicked off the American conservation movement to gain control of resources and lock them away from development by competitors. It was never about pristine vistas and clean water. It was about locking up mineral deposits and stealing water rights. The EPA and the FDA were later created for similar reasons, not to protect the public, but to protect markets and promote profits for the perpetrators and their friends. Pure and simple, the Federal Reserve banks bought a governmental services corporation that never had a valid contract with the continental United States in the first place, and pretended to be the government. But they are not, and never were, and never can be. They are nothing but con artists who have defrauded us, stolen our assets in exchange for worthless paper, manipulated commodity markets, controlled transportation, crippled development, and piled up mountains of odious debt against us, our organic states, and our property assets. Odious debt. Debt established by false pretenses, semantic deceit, or other means of fraud of which the victims are unaware, and from which they do not profit. Such debts are void by definition and cannot be collected. What national debt? In a debt credit system, every debt creates an answering credit. If there is a $25 trillion national debt, there is also a $25 trillion national credit. So, let's talk about the national credit, which is owed by the banks and their pals to the American people and the organic states of the Union. The essence of fraudulent convertible debt is to create what appears to be a debt, but which is in fact a credit, then get the victim to assume the fake debt and pay it, which leaves the perpetrator in possession of an equal amount of extra credit, which they are then free to invest and use for their own profit. Every month across America, utility companies double bill for their charges. They charge off all the operating expenses against the credit of the American people at the U.S. Treasury, and then they send those same people billing statements, which appear to be bills for services rendered. They make sure that the victims pay up by threatening them with disconnection. Then they invest the purloined additional credits for the benefit of their organization. In this way, they build up immense capital credit fund accounts in the names of each victim, but the customer victims are never allowed to touch these accounts or make use of the credit. Variations of this same swindle have been used by the banks and the government agencies to milk and bilk the American people for 3 generations. These corporations have fed on us like parasites and grown fat and powerful from glutting on our credit and our assets. 1913. The Federal Reserve banks and their cronies in Congress passed the Federal Reserve Act and established a fiat money system to be used by the United States Inc. and its many franchises as legal tender. The banks are given a license for 100 years to print money and receive the full face value of the bills, plus interest, as additional profit. So, it cost them about 4 cents to print each Federal Reserve note, and they got the full face value of that bill back, plus interest, from the Americans. This was done despite every law against usury and despite the requirement for real money plainly stated in the Constitution for the United States of America that was and is still in effect and still owed to the American states on the land. Note the note scam. Federal Reserve notes like United States notes and George F. Schniedelmeyer notes are nothing but IOUs, promises to pay later. Newsflash: you go deeper into debt. A negative plus a negative always equals a bigger negative. The Federal Reserve Association and its Board of Governors designed the Federal Reserve System as a means to entrap Americans into eternal indebtedness that could only increase exponentially. Every time anyone paid a debt with a Federal Reserve note, they accrued more debt for themselves. And they had no other practical choice than to use Federal Reserve notes, because the Federal Reserve System had a legalized monopoly. The Federal Reserve System took no risk, paid nobody for anything, and simply collected the debt. This means that they cheated Americans out of their labor and resources in exchange for promises to pay, siphoned it all off in exchange for worthless paper. Then, in 2009, the Federal Reserve System transferred the bulk of its assets to a new entity organized under the United Nations, Inc., doing business as the Federal Reserve, Inc., and declared the old version bankrupt, leaving the hapless Americans to pay their national debt. What are we supposed to pay it with? According to Congress, with more notes. Backed by the good faith of the U.S. Congress. This is an obvious criminal fraud scheme, but nobody is doing anything about it, except the 133 nations already spearheading the BRIC's initiative, over half the world's population, China, Russia, India, Brazil. They are all looking at the Brits, the Canadians, the Aussies, and most of all at the Americans, wondering, when are you going to wake up? A nation of well-informed men who have been taught to know and prize the rights which God has given them cannot be enslaved. It is in the regions of ignorance that tyranny begins. Benjamin Franklin. Be thankful we're not getting all the government we're paying for. Will Rogers. 1917. Non-existent war powers and emergency powers. In 1917, the corporate Congress, under the sway of the new banker bosses, made another gross power grab and claimed to have war powers that were never granted to them and which, strictly speaking, do not exist. Nonetheless, they passed the War Powers Act and gratuitously conscripted all the private property in America for the war effort. Conscripted means they borrowed every man, woman, cat, and chicken coop in America for military use. The U.S. Army became an army of occupation at that point. They also came under the Hague Conventions, which require them to protect all non-combatant civilians and their private property assets, including their natural and unalienable rights, which are material assets of the National Trust, and to act as faithful usufruct under the rules of usufruct established by the Hague Conventions, and to return all civilian property unharmed and unencumbered by any debt resulting from their use of it. The Hague Conventions 4, Article 55, and the Laws of War 2, Article 3, forbidding changing status to a public citizen of the United States, Inc., are both provisions that the members of Congress and the Joint Chiefs of Staff would rather ignore, but really can't. They also can't ignore Section 21 of the Applications Appendix of the Trading with the Enemy Act, which specifically excluded American state citizens from being classified as enemies. Purchase a hard copy of this book at Amazon.com or download a free PDF copy at states.americanstatenationals.org. Click on the red Education tab at the top right of the page. You will find it here.